Chapter 1, The Shape of Absence. Zane Mitchell learned something important about silence at 33. It wasn't empty. It had shape, weight, even intention. He could sit between two people on a sofa and pretend it was just air, while quietly becoming everything. He'd always been good at paying attention. It was one of the qualities Stephanie had once loved about him, that he noticed things before they had to be pointed out. He remembered birthdays without reminders, folded laundry the way she liked it, stocked the fridge based on a mental inventory he updated subconsciously, which was how he knew something had gone wrong long before he was told. The confirmation came on a Wednesday afternoon, in a bar that tried too hard to look casual. The lighting was flattering in a way that suggested insecurity, and the menu described burgers as handheld experiences. Zane had suggested the place because it was neutral, no memories, no shared habits. He hadn't known what the conversation would be, only that it couldn't happen over coffee. Mark, Stephanie's best friend's newly former husband, sat across from him with a beer he hadn't touched. "You don't have to tell me anything," Zane said, because he meant it. "I'm not here to collect details." Mark barked a humorless laugh. "That's kind of you. Nobody else has been." Zane didn't respond. He waited. Mark ran a hand through his hair, the motion automatic, exhausted. "She told you we just grew apart, right?" "Yes." "Did Stephanie say that too?" "She did," Zane said carefully. Mark nodded, lips pressing together. Figures. There it was, a pause shaped like a confession. Zane felt a familiar internal click, the sound his thoughts made when something locked into place. "She was seeing someone," Mark said. "Met him when she was out with friends after work. Not an affair that snuck up on her," he added bitterly. "She made space for it." Zane swallowed. The bar smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and cooked meat. A television murmured sports at low volume. "I'm sorry," Zane said. "That's brutal." Mark shrugged. "I caught them. That's the part people think matters most. Doesn't. What matters is she made it normal. Lied about where she was, who she was with." His eyes lifted. Stephanie was there. Not every time, but enough. The world didn't tilt. It didn't narrow. It didn't speed up. It simply rearranged. Zane listened without interruption as Mark spoke. Not venting, exactly, but filing an emotional report. The timeline was unmistakably familiar. Weeknights that stretched late. Stories delivered casually, with just enough detail to discourage follow-ups. The gradual disappearance of affection disguised as stress. 5 months. Zane paid for both drinks. They shook hands. Mark thanked him for listening in a voice that suggested that two had become rare. On the walk home, Zane passed couples arguing softly, laughing loudly, not arguing at all. The city continued with democratic indifference. Stephanie was already home when he arrived. She sat cross-legged on the sofa, laptop open, hair tucked behind one ear. The lamp cast her in warm light, as if nothing in the world had learned anything unpleasant. "Hey," she said. "How was your afternoon?" "Fine," Zane replied, which was the truest socially acceptable word available. She smiled, then gestured to the kitchen. "I didn't know when you'd be back, so I ordered that Thai place you like. There's leftovers." "Thanks." He set his keys down. Not in the bowl. Beside it. He noticed things. Later, lying in bed, Zane stared at the ceiling while Stephanie slept beside him, breathing evenly. He counted patterns in the drywall he'd never really looked at before. He did the math again, even though it always came out the same. 5 months without intimacy. 5 months of vague evenings out. 3 instances that came back to him uninvited. The faintly unfamiliar cologne once, twice, 3 times. Each brushed off. Each plausible. Plausible until it wasn't. He didn't feel rage. That surprised him. He felt resolved. Like someone who had crossed the final piece of ambiguous terrain and arrived at certainty. The next morning he adjusted, not outwardly but fundamentally. He made coffee for both of them as usual, slid her mug across the counter. "Thanks, babe," Stephanie said, distracted, already scrolling. "You're welcome." He kissed her cheek, lightly, the way one kissed a friend without misleading either of them. At work, he closed the browser tab estimating divorce costs. He reopened it. He closed it again. He wasn't filing. Not yet. Not without facts that could survive daylight. But trust, once withdrawn, did not require evidence. It required judgment. That evening, Stephanie mentioned she'd be out late, helping her friend process things. Zane nodded. "Have a good time." She hesitated. Just a fraction too long. "You okay?" she asked. Of course. It wasn't passive aggression. It was independence. After she left, Zane cooked for one. He ate slowly. He went for a walk. He noticed how much of the city existed outside the radius of his marriage. By the time Stephanie came home, just after midnight, he was already asleep, or convincingly so. From that night forward, Zane Mitchell lived according to a quiet rule. He wouldn't punish. He wouldn't pretend. And he wouldn't surrender his clarity for the illusion of peace. The space between them did not vanish. Took its shape. Chapter 2, Living Loudly. Zane discovered that living his life normally, but for himself, required far more intention than he'd expected. It began the following Saturday, with sunlight flooding the bedroom earlier than he liked and Stephanie already gone. Her side of the bed was smooth, the pillow barely dented, as if sleep had visited it only symbolically. A note sat on the kitchen counter in her tidy, looping handwriting. Brunch with Clara. Back later. No apology. No explanation. Just an update. Zane read it, folded it once, and tucked it into the small drawer where he kept odd screws and instruction manuals for appliances they no longer owned. He made coffee for one and drank it standing up, leaning against the counter as the city woke audibly beyond the windows. Normally, weekends were a choreography. Gym together, groceries together, a shared indecision around lunch that inevitably ended in the same sandwich place. He missed the pattern more than the person, which felt like a revelation worth sitting with. He went to the gym alone. That, too, had changed over the past months. Stephanie used to tease him about his meticulous warm-ups. Lately, she'd stopped coming entirely, citing exhaustion, late nights, meetings that never seemed to end. Zane stretched as he always had, but noticed the absence beside him like a limb he'd learned to compensate for. He ran longer than usual. Not punishingly, just decisively. When his lungs burned, it felt honest. Afterward, he stood in the locker room, towel slung low on his hips, watching his phone light up and darken without messages. He used to text Stephanie while he cooled down. Something light, an inside joke, a plan for later. He didn't today. Instead, he called his friend Owen. Brunch. Owen answered, sounding half awake. Already ate, Zane said. But I'm thinking tacos later. Is this a cry for help? No. It's a statement of intent. There was a pause. Should I be concerned? You should be hungry. Owen laughed. 7. Same place. 7 came quickly. Zane showered, dressed, and realized halfway down the sidewalk that he felt lighter. Not happier, exactly, but unburdened by anticipation. He hadn't been waiting all day for Stephanie to return. For her mood, for what version of her would walk through the door. He was already somewhere else. The taco place buzzed with conversation and heat. Owen slid into the booth across from him, eyes flicking briefly over Zane's expression. You look different, Owen said. Different how? Like someone who deleted an app they secretly hated, Owen replied. Zane smiled. That accurate? Do I want to know which app? Probably not. They ate. They talked about work. Owen ranted about a client who kept changing their mind while insisting they'd always been clear. Zane listened attentively, genuinely amused. He realized how long it had been since he'd been fully present with someone without mentally budgeting energy for a conversation he'd have later at home. When he returned that evening, Stephanie was already there, curled on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. Hey, she said, glancing up. I thought you'd be gone all day. I was out, he said, setting his jacket over the chair back. With who? Owen. Her eyebrows lifted minutely. You didn't say anything. I didn't think I needed to. That's not what I meant, she said quickly. I just didn't know. Zane nodded. Now you do. He went into the kitchen. He cooked dinner for himself, methodically, blocking out the faint sense of performance he felt from her glances. Curiosity, mild irritation, something sharper beneath. They ate in silence. Not uncomfortable. Simply quiet. Over the next week, Zane expanded his orbit. He enrolled in a pottery class he'd once joked about but never pursued. He stayed late at work to mentor a junior analyst who reminded him of himself. A decade earlier, eager and cautious in equal measure. He started taking long evening walks, headphones in, playlists he hadn't shared with anyone. Stephanie noticed. Of course she did. You're busy lately, she said one night, not looking at him as she said it. I am. With what? Life, Zane replied lightly. She laughed, a bit too sharply. That's vague. So is busy. She exhaled. Are you upset with me? Zane considered the question carefully. He'd promised himself honesty, but not recklessness. No, he said. I'm just not waiting anymore. For what? For the version of us that required me to pause everything else. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That's not fair. He met her eyes. Neither is pretending everything stayed the same. She stood abruptly. I'm going out. Enjoy, he said. She paused at the door. Waiting for more, perhaps. He gave none. The days gained a rhythm that belonged to him. Strangely, it wasn't dramatic. It was steady, and people responded to steadiness. At work, a new project partner, Maya-chan, began meeting with him regularly. Their conversations were efficient, thoughtful, punctuated by dry humor and mutual respect. She challenged his assumptions. He liked that. One evening, as they wrapped up a late discussion, she gestured toward the hallway. There's a bookstore cafe downstairs. They do decent espresso and terrible poetry readings. Want to decompress? Zane hesitated, not from temptation, but awareness. Sure. They talked about books they'd loved and books they'd pretended to love. About how ambition aged differently in different people. Maya mentioned her divorce casually, without bitterness, as if it had been a completed chapter. I learned I don't do ambiguity well, she said. I need clarity, even when it hurts. Zane nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. She studied him for a moment. You don't sound surprised. I'm learning, he said. At home later, Stephanie was already in bed, reading. You're out late, she said. Yes, with work. Among other things, she turned a page, jaw tightening. You're being deliberately evasive. I'm being honest, Zane replied. Just not explanatory. She closed the book. Do you want this marriage or not? He took a breath, chose his words. I want a marriage built on trust, he said. That's not something I can manufacture alone. Silence bloomed between them. That night, lying back to back, Zane felt something unexpected. Not grief, but resolve deepening. The absence had a shape now, but it no longer frightened him. It simply marked the space he was finally allowed to fill. Chapter 3, The Unexpected Variable. Pottery, Zane learned, was an exercise in public humility. The studio smelled of wet clay and something metallic, water left too long in pipes, wheels hummed in uneven harmony, and every surface bore the evidence of effort. Finger grooves, smeared slip, the ghosts of bowls that hadn't survived their own ambition. Zane arrived 5 minutes early, as he did to everything now. He liked the quiet buffer. It gave him space to settle into himself before the rest of the world arrived. He wedged clay at his station, palms pressing down, folding, turning, repeating the motion until the weight felt cooperative. The instructor, a woman with forearms like proof of experience, moved through the room, offering nods instead of greetings. Other students filtered in, a couple holding hands too tightly, a trio of friends already laughing. A woman in a green sweater who took the stool beside his, set down her bag, and exhaled as if she'd been underwater all day. Have you done this before? She asked, rolling up her sleeves. Once, Zane said. I made something that aspired to be a mug and settled for being conceptual. She smiled. Ambitious clay is the most dangerous kind. I'm Zane. Elena. They shook hands. Her grip was warm, grounded, not tentative. As the class began, Zane focused on the wheel. He centered the clay with a patience he didn't apply to many things anymore. It wobbled, resisted, then finally complied beneath steady pressure. Elena worked quietly beside him, occasionally murmuring a curse under her breath when her form slumped. Too fast, Zane said, surprising himself. She glanced over. Story of my life. He smiled but didn't elaborate. Neither did she. When the hour ended, their pieces were respectable. Misshapen in the way of earnest beginners but intact. Coffee? Elena asked, gesturing toward her bag. There's a place around the corner that won't judge us for being covered in clay. Zane hesitated not from uncertainty, but from awareness. He measured himself constantly now, like a man learning the edges of a new map. I'd like that, he said. The cafe was narrow and bright, the kind of place that believed in minimalism with religious fervor. They washed their hands in a sink so small it seemed designed to discourage cleanliness, then claimed a corner table. Elena wrapped her hands around her cup. So, pottery. Is this a midlife crisis or a long-held dream? Neither, Zane said. More like recalibration. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. I took up fencing after my divorce. Really? Yes. I discovered I enjoy rules and sharp objects when I'm emotionally overwhelmed. Zane laughed, caught off guard by the sound. I should have tried that. They talked easily, not deeply at first. Work frustrations, the physical comedy of adult learning curves, the shared relief of doing something analog in a digital world. At no point did he feel the need to impress her. That, more than anything, set the interaction apart. I'm married, Zane said eventually, because truth came easier now when it was offered early. Elena didn't flinch. Good to know. There was no follow-up question. No apology for assumption. And you? He asked. She shrugged. Not currently. I don't rush into new arrangements. Learned that the hard way. They drank their coffee. The moment passed without thickening into something else, and that was, unexpectedly, comforting. That night, Zane came home later than usual. Stephanie sat at the table, bills spread out, calculator nearby. Domestic logistics, once sacred, now neutral. There you are, she said. We need to talk about the utilities. They went up again. Okay, Zane said, setting his bag down. What do you need from me? She blinked. You used to just, no. I still can, he said. I'm asking for clarity. Her lips parted, then closed again. She named a number. He nodded. Agreed. The conversation ended without lingering. Later, in bed, she shifted closer. Not reaching, just nearing. Zane adjusted away slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. I miss you, she said softly into the dark. I'm here, he replied. It wasn't the same thing. They both knew it. The following week, Zane and Elena sat together again in class. Their bowls improved. So did their conversation. They talked about books this time. About the absurdity of nostalgia. About how people mistook intensity for intimacy. Do you believe in emotional cheating? Elena asked, hands slick with clay. Zane paused the wheel. I believe in emotional honesty. Anything that undermines that counts. She studied him. That's a careful answer. I've had practice. She smiled, not flirtatious, but appreciative. So have I. On Thursday, Maya from work invited him to a small after-hours lecture on behavioral economics. Zane attended, engaged fully, then declined drinks afterward, opting for a walk home instead. He was learning that restraint didn't diminish pleasure. It sharpened it. At home, Stephanie watched him kick off his shoes. You've changed, she said. Yes. She crossed her arms. Do you like who you're becoming? He met her gaze. I do. That answer unsettled her more than anger would have. On Sunday morning, Zane made breakfast for himself while Stephanie slept late. He ate standing at the counter, sunlight pooling on the floor. His phone buzzed. Elena, I tried to make a bowl at home. Learned why studios exist. Coffee later? He typed, then paused, then typed again. Zane, yes. For coffee. They met at the same cafe. No expectations, just presence. Elena watched him stir his drink. You're good at being careful. So are you. She tilted her head. That doesn't sound like praise. Maybe it's acknowledgement. She accepted that. Fair. There was a moment, inevitable, human, when their eyes held a fraction longer than necessary. Neither moved toward closing the distance. I'm glad we met, she said. Regardless of where this goes. Zane nodded. Me too. He left first. On the walk home, the city felt vivid. Not seductive. Alive. At the apartment door, he realized something essential had shifted. Not because of temptation but contrast. Connection didn't have to come at the cost of integrity. And for the first time in months, the absence inside him wasn't empty space. It was room. Chapter 4. Stephanie's version of the weather. Stephanie noticed the silence before she acknowledged its meaning. It arrived disguised as space. Room to breathe, mornings without commentary, evenings without negotiation. At first, she told herself this was what Zane had wanted. Autonomy, freedom, less pressure. She had given him that, hadn't she? But silence, she was learning, wasn't a gift if it hadn't been requested. On Tuesday morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror adjusting her blazer, watching Zane move behind her in the reflection. He shaved with deliberate calm, humming softly, something instrumental, unfamiliar. Their elbows did not bump. Their eyes did not meet. Once, that would have unsettled her. Now it felt like a test she hadn't studied for. You're in early today, she said, because observation was safer than inquiry. Meeting moved up, Zane replied. He rinsed the razor, wiped it dry, set it down with care. She waited. He didn't elaborate. Stephanie turned back to the mirror, applied lipstick she'd bought recently, brighter than her usual, and wondered who she'd hoped would notice. At work, she struggled to focus. Spreadsheets blurred. Emails piled up unanswered while she stared at her monitor, replaying moments from the past months, rearranging them, trying to locate the precise instant where the narrative had tilted. She told herself she hadn't done anything wrong. That was the sentence she kept returning to, as if repetition could calcify it into truth. She hadn't slept with anyone else. That mattered. That had to matter. She had gone out more. That was normal. Clara needed support. Divorce rattled people, it demanded presence, loyalty. Stephanie had been a good friend, a necessary friend. Clara had insisted the nights out were harmless, just drinks, dancing, a reminder that they were still visible, still wanted. And maybe Stephanie had liked that more than she wanted to admit. By the time Clara's husband had discovered the affair, not Stephanie's doing, she emphasized internally, things had already shifted. The secrecy had thickened into something weighty, unignorable. Stephanie had chosen to lie. Not to Zane specifically, she justified, but to the version of him that asked too many questions, that saw too clearly. She told herself it was temporary, compassionate, protective. Protective of what exactly, she wasn't sure. Lately, though, the lies had become obsolete. Zane wasn't asking anymore. That evening, Stephanie came home early on purpose. She cooked, a real effort, not the default fallback. He arrived while she was plating, jacket slung over one shoulder. You're home, he said, surprised but not pleased. Yes, she replied too brightly. Thought we could eat together. Okay. They sat. The food was good. The air was not. So, she said, clearing her throat. You've been busy lately. Zane looked up. I have. With work? She prompted. And other things. Her fork paused mid-air. Like what? He met her gaze calmly. Things that are mine. The words landed harder than anger. Mine implied exclusion. Territory she hadn't realized she'd lost. I feel like you're pushing me away, she said quietly. I'm standing where I am, he replied. You're interpreting distance. She swallowed. That sounds intentional. It is. Stephanie leaned back, arms folding defensively. Not to guard herself, she told herself, but to stay upright. What do you want from me? She asked. Zane considered her. She wished, absurdly, that he'd raise his voice, that he'd accuse her of something specific she could deny or dismantle. I want honesty, he said at last. Not selectively applied. Her pulse kicked. I've been honest. He held the silence like a mirror. Let her look. That night, she lay awake listening to his breathing, steady and unconcerned. She turned toward him once, almost reaching out, then stopped. Some boundary, new, invisible, felt dangerously real. The next afternoon, she met Clara for drinks. The bar was familiar, comforting. He's changed, Stephanie said, swirling her glass. Clara snorted. Men always do when they hit their 30s. Suddenly they discover hobbies. This is different, Stephanie insisted. He's composed. Like he already decided something and forgot to inform me. Clara shrugged. Did you want to inform him about everything else? Stephanie stiffened. I didn't cheat. I know, Clara said gently. But you didn't stay neutral either. That's not fair. It's not an accusation. Just reality. Stephanie stared into her drink. I didn't think it would matter. That's the problem, Clara said. You thought it wouldn't affect you. Stephanie went home angry. At Clara, at Zane. At the way consequences seemed to have found her despite her careful avoidance of them. Zane wasn't there. She wandered the apartment restlessly, noticing things she'd ignored for years. The bookshelf arranged by subject because he liked it that way. The throw blanket folded with unnecessary precision. His life was threaded through the space. She had mistaken presence for permanence. When he came home, she was waiting. I want to be close again, she said, without preamble. I miss us. Zane stopped, studied her face with concern, yes, but not yearning. I don't know if that version of us exists right now, he said gently. Why not? He exhaled. Because closeness requires trust, and trust requires alignment. Her voice cracked. I never betrayed you. He nodded once. You redefined fidelity without discussing it. The truth stung sharply enough to feel like injustice. Stephanie turned away, blinking hard. So what, you're punishing me? No, Zane said. I'm refusing to pretend. She walked into the bedroom alone, closed the door more firmly than necessary. In the dark, she confronted an unfamiliar realization. She hadn't lost Zane through action. She'd lost him through drift. And drift, once noticed, was much harder to deny than betrayal. Chapter 5, Lines in Sand. Stephanie chose Thursday because Thursdays used to mean something. It had been their night once, not out of tradition so much as gravity. Work slowed just enough. The weekend loomed without pressure. Thursday dinners lingered. Thursday intimacy didn't feel scheduled. It felt assumed. She cooked again, this time with precision. Clean lines. No improvisation. Something familiar enough to suggest ease, elevated enough to signal intent. Zane arrived home to the scent of garlic and thyme and stopped. Not because it stirred longing, but because it carried memory. He hung his coat carefully, washed his hands, joined her at the table. The conversation stayed light. Topics chosen with surgical care. No work stress. No friends. No Clara. When they finished eating, Stephanie cleared the plates herself, though that had never been her habit. She moved closer afterward, leaned against the counter beside him while he wiped it down out of reflex. You smell like soap, she said softly. Unscented, Zane replied. Dermatologist recommendation. She smiled. A real one, he thought. Or a close approximation. She touched his arm. Casual. Testing. Zane stilled, not pulling away, but not leaning in. Just pausing the moment. Can we talk? She asked. Yes, he said. Anytime. Not like that. Her voice dropped. About us. He turned fully toward her. Removed his hands from the counter. Gave her his attention without elevation or defense. Okay. She hesitated. Then reached for him more deliberately, fingers brushing the inside of his wrist, where she knew he was most responsive. I want to be close again, she said. I want you. The words were correct. The tone practiced but sincere. It would have worked once. Not long ago, not before absence had taught him to listen differently. Zane took a slow breath. I hear you, he said. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one. She searched his face. Are you not attracted to me anymore? That's not the issue. Then what is? Her voice tightened. Because I'm standing right here, Zane. I'm trying. He nodded slightly. I know. She waited. I'm not comfortable being intimate right now, he said calmly. And I don't think pretending otherwise would be fair to either of us. The words landed with controlled force. Not rejection. Not softness. Boundary. Stephanie stepped back, as if she'd misjudged physical distance. Why? She asked. You won't even touch me. That's not true, he said gently. I touch you all the time, just not like that. She folded her arms, the gesture sharper this time. So this is punishment. No, Zane said immediately. It's self-respect. She stared at him. You don't get to weaponize virtue. I'm not, he replied. I'm being honest about my limits. And mine? She shot back. What about what I need? I'm not stopping you from having needs, he said. I'm telling you what I can responsibly offer right now. Her laugh came out brittle. Responsibly? Yes, he said. Responsibly. She shook her head. This is insane. You're acting like I did something to you. You changed the terms of trust without telling me, Zane said. That affects intimacy. It has to. I didn't cheat. I'm not debating labels, he replied evenly. I'm talking about alignment. She stepped toward him again. Then let's realign. Let's fix it. Zane met her gaze, unwavering. Fixing it requires more than physical closeness. Silence pooled between them, deepening. What if I just miss my husband? She asked, quieter now. He softened, not retreating, but human. Then I need to know you miss this husband, he said. Not the version who didn't ask questions. That cut. She felt it land and couldn't deflect it. I never thought you'd be like this, she said. Neither did I. He moved past her, not in escape but conclusion, and sat on the couch. Picked up a book he'd left open earlier. Stephanie stood alone in the kitchen, heat from the stove long since cooled. Later that night, she came to bed wearing something deliberate. Not overt. Intentional. Zane noticed and turned off his lamp without commentary. Her back was rigid beside him, breath tight. You're shutting me out, she said into the dark. I'm keeping myself intact, he replied. The next day, Zane scheduled a full physical through his doctor's patient portal. He didn't mention it to Stephanie. There were things one did quietly, not as signals, but as vows. After work, he met Elena at the studio early. They worked side by side without rush. You seem steadier today, she observed. I drew a line, Zane said. Elena nodded. Those matter more than people think. They changed the map, he agreed. When class ended, they walked outside together. Evening light softened the street. The air held that pre-rain expectation New York specialized in. Coffee? Elena asked. Not tonight, Zane said. But soon, she smiled. I'll take soon. At home, Stephanie sat on the couch, phone in hand, expression unreadable. We need to talk, she said. Zane set his bag down, sat across from her. She swallowed. If this goes on like this, if you refuse me, I don't know what that means for us. It means we're not pretending, he said. And pretending is what breaks things irreparably. She exhaled sharply. You're so calm about this. I had time to process, Zane replied. I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to be accurate. Her voice wavered. And what if I tell you nothing happened? He looked at her steadily. Then nothing would stop you from telling me everything else. She opened her mouth, closed it. That answer, he realized, was an answer all on its own. Zane stood. I'm going for a walk. She watched him leave, the door closing with absolute restraint. Outside, the city breathed around him. Unconcerned, attentive, alive. Zane didn't feel victorious. He felt aligned. And alignment, he was discovering, was the hardest line to cross, and the most necessary to hold. Chapter 6, Half-Truths Don't Heal. The invitation arrived on a Monday afternoon, neatly formatted and impossible to avoid. Housewarming drinks. Friday, 7 p.m. New place, same faces. Hope you both can come. It was from Lila, a mutual friend whose optimism had survived 3 career changes and 1 spectacularly ill-advised engagement. The guest list, implied rather than stated, would be familiar: coworkers, spouses, friends of friends who had already memorized one another's anecdotes. Stephanie forwarded it to Zane with a single line. We should go. Zane read it once, then again. We? He asked that evening, looking up from the counter where he was chopping onions with ceremonial focus. Stephanie hovered behind him, already dressed down, already rehearsing. People will notice if we don't. They notice anyway. She crossed her arms. Avoidance looks like guilt. Or discretion, Zane said. She sighed. Please, just this once. I don't want rumors. Zane turned the burner off, set the knife aside. I won't perform to preserve a story I didn't create, he said calmly. But I will attend if you're willing to be honest. Her mouth tightened. About what? He met her eyes. About where we actually are. That's not something people need to know. Then neither is pretending we're fine. The standoff lasted only a moment. Stephanie's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. Just, don't embarrass me, she said quietly. Then don't put me in the position to, he replied. Friday evening arrived with cooperative weather and insufficient clarity. They walked to the party together, not touching, not distant enough to signal fracture to strangers, but coordinated only by habit. Lila's apartment buzzed with soft music and overlapping conversations, the kind of gathering that invited proximity without intimacy. Zane, Lila exclaimed, hugging him with the enthusiasm of someone who believed affection could solve things preemptively. Stephanie, you made it. Stephanie smiled easily. Zane noticed the effort. They dispersed quickly. Stephanie pulled into a conversation near the windows, Zane gravitating toward the kitchen island, where Owen nursed a drink. Good turnout, Owen said. Looks that way. Owen studied him. You good? Zane nodded. I am. It wasn't a lie. Across the room, Zane spotted Clara. She saw him too, hesitation stretching between recognition and avoidance. Stephanie, mid-sentence, stiffened almost imperceptibly when Clara joined her circle. The dynamic was unmistakable. Not secretive. More defended. Zane watched, observed how Stephanie laughed a half-beat too late at Clara's comments. How Clara avoided eye contact during certain subjects. The choreography of omission. "Hey!" a voice said. Maya stood beside him, holding a soda. "Didn't know you were coming." "I was persuaded." She smiled. "Same. Social obligations are aggressive." They talked comfortably. About nothing important. About how gatherings like this pretended to be casual while secretly tallying outcomes. Stephanie noticed. Zane felt it. Not her gaze exactly, but the sharpened awareness behind it. Later, Lila clinked her glass for attention. Housewarming toast. Groans and cheers complied. In the brief hush, Lila gestured broadly. "Special thanks to my friends who survived relocations, breakups, job changes, and whatever waves in Zane and Stephanie's direction marital gymnastics are happening these days." Laughter rippled. Light, careless. Zane felt Stephanie's hand tense on his arm. "Just kidding," Lila added quickly. "You two are solid." Silence followed, only a fraction of a second too long. Zane smiled politely. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "We're honest." The word landed with unexpected weight. Lila blinked. Someone coughed. Stephanie's hand dropped. Conversation resumed, but something had shifted permanently. An acknowledgement without detail. The room recalibrated. People adjusted expectations, if not understanding. Stephanie leaned toward him. "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true," he replied. "And because anything else would have been untrue." She pulled away, anger sharp and sudden. "You humiliated me." "I corrected a narrative," he said. "That's different." She went to the balcony, glass clenched too tightly. Clara followed. Zane stayed. Not rooted. Intentional. Maya raised her eyebrows. "That was measured." "I aim for accuracy," Zane said. "Oh, inside. You always did." When they left, the walk home was quiet but not brittle. "You could have handled that better," Stephanie said finally. "I could have handled it louder," Zane replied. "I chose restraint." She stopped walking, turned to face him under a street lamp. "You're punishing me in public now." "No," he said. "I'm refusing to carry secrets that weren't mine." Her breath hitched. "You don't know what you're implying." "I know exactly what I'm leaving room for," Zane said softly. "Truth." She looked away. For the first time, uncertainty outweighed defensiveness. At home, she went straight to the bedroom, closed the door. Zane sat alone in the living room. Lights low, city sound drifting through the window. His phone buzzed. "Maya, if you ever want coffee without social gymnastics, you know where to find me." He smiled faintly, put the phone face down. Tonight wasn't about escape. It was about clarity, shared, witnessed, irreversible. Half-truths he knew now didn't heal. They just postponed the reckoning. Chapter 7. Evidence. The thing Zane hadn't expected about evidence was how quietly it arrived. Not as a dramatic revelation. Not as a confrontation staged for maximum damage. It came instead on a Tuesday evening, dressed as inconvenience, padded with apology, and delivered by accident. He was home earlier than usual, the apartment empty in that distinctly hollow way it only ever was when Stephanie wasn't there and didn't expect him to be. His phone buzzed with a delayed calendar alert. Pottery class canceled. Instructor sick. He'd already been on the subway when he saw it, already rerouting his evening in his head. He unlocked the door and tossed his keys onto the console. They landed with a clatter he normally would have corrected. Today he left them. Stephanie's laptop sat open on the dining table. That alone wouldn't have registered once. They shared space, shared utilities, shared furniture that had outlasted several conversations that hadn't. What caught his attention was the glow, not the neutral blue of a desktop background, but the warmer, conversational palette of a messaging app. An incoming notification slid into view and lingered just long enough to be readable before fading. Can't stop thinking about Friday. Zane stopped walking. He didn't move closer immediately, didn't touch the laptop. He stood there, allowing the moment to exist without escalation, without reaction, the way he trained himself to do. His pulse remained steady. His thoughts organized themselves with unsettling efficiency. He knew the rules. He hadn't agreed to surveillance. He hadn't wanted to become the kind of man who searched. But this wasn't searching. This was being addressed. Another message followed a moment later. "You okay?" You went quiet. Zane sat down. The conversation pane was already open, the cursor blinking patiently in the reply box Stephanie hadn't yet filled. The name at the top wasn't Clara's. It wasn't anyone he recognized. There were no explicit photos, no graphic language, no declarations dressed up as inevitability. What there was instead was continuity. Weeks' worth of messages, time-stamped fragments of shared context, jokes with callbacks, references to specific nights, specific moods, familiarity thick enough to displace coincidence entirely. "I like the way you listen. I shouldn't have worn that jacket if I wanted to behave. Next time we won't be in such a public place." Zane closed the laptop gently. He didn't read further. He didn't need to triangulate. The shape was unmistakable now. The outline filled in with undeniable clarity. He stood, walked into the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed, rested his hands flat on his thighs, breathed. There was grief, yes, but distant, contained. What he felt more strongly was resolution finishing its work. Stephanie came home an hour later. She stepped inside already talking. Something about traffic, a train delay, then stopped short when she saw him waiting. "You're home early," she said. "Yes." Something in his tone made her set her bag down carefully. "Zane, your laptop was open," he said. The silence that followed wasn't shocked. It wasn't confused. It was resigned. She closed her eyes briefly. "You read my messages." "I read enough," he replied. "More than enough." She opened her mouth, likely prepared to explain, contextualize, humanize. He held up a hand, not sharply, not angrily. "Please don't," he said. "Not yet." She sat opposite him, folding herself smaller than usual, as if that might soften what was coming. "I didn't sleep with him," she said quickly. "I know that's not nothing, but—" "Stephanie?" Zane interrupted gently. "This isn't a courtroom. I'm not negotiating thresholds." Her eyes glistened. "I never meant to hurt you." He nodded. Intent and impact rarely arrive together. She swallowed. "I was lonely." "You were not alone," he replied. Not accusing, stating fact. "I didn't think it would go this far." "It always does," Zane said quietly. "That's what boundaries are for. To stop momentum before it builds physics." She stared at the floor. "I kept telling myself I'd stop. And then you didn't," he finished. She nodded, tears slipping free now. "I liked how it felt. Being wanted. Being seen." Zane let the statement hang, unchallenged. Recognition didn't require rebuttal. "I wish you'd talk to me," he said. "I wish you'd trusted me with the truth before I had to find it this way." "I was afraid," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed. Fear is usually present when people choose convenience over honesty. They sat like that for a long moment, two people finally sharing the same reality, even if nothing about it was mutual anymore. "What happens now?" she asked. Zane considered the question. He was surprised to find that the answer, when it came, was already formed. "Now," he said, "we stop pretending this is reparable in its current state." Her breath caught. "You said you didn't want a divorce." "I didn't," he said. "I didn't want this either. So that's it." Her voice cracked. 6 years. And it ends because of messages? "It ends because trust became optional," Zane replied calmly. "The messages just documented the choice." She shook her head. "I never crossed a physical line." "You crossed the line where you would have told me about it," he said. "That's the one that matters to me." Tears slid down her face unchecked. "Is there anything I can do?" Zane stood. The motion was unhurried, final. "You can be honest," he said. "Completely. With yourself first. With me second. That's the only useful thing left." She watched him walk toward the door, panic rising. "Where are you going?" "For a walk," he said. "To give us both some air." He paused with his hand on the knob. "We'll talk again. Promise. But not tonight." Outside, the city met him as it always did, with noise, movement, indifference. He welcomed it. His phone buzzed. A message from Elena, sent earlier, unread until now. "Studios open late if you need somewhere neutral." Zane smiled faintly, not at the invitation but the consideration. "Thank you," he typed. "I'm okay." And for the first time since the quiet certainty had settled months ago, that was undeniably true. The evidence hadn't destroyed his life. It had clarified it. And clarity, however painful, was finally something he could move forward with. Chapter 8, Terms of Reality. They spoke 2 days later, deliberately. Not in the heat of discovery. Not with the adrenaline of defense or the desperation of salvage. Zane insisted on time, not as punishment, but preparation. Stephanie agreed because she had no leverage to refuse. They met at the dining table. Laptops closed, phones face down, coffee cooling unanswered. The apartment felt temporarily neutral, as if it understood it was being evaluated. "I told Clara everything," Stephanie said first. Zane nodded. "Good. She thinks I should fight for this." "I'm sure she does." Stephanie winced, not at the dismissal but the accuracy. "I'm not here to persuade you." "That's a start." She folded her hands. They trembled slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about redefining fidelity." Zane waited. "I didn't think emotional connection counted as betrayal because I never let it become physical," she continued. "I treated the boundary like a technicality, like a loophole." "Yes," Zane said. "That's what it was." "I see that now," she added quickly. "I really do." He believed her. That wasn't the problem. "I also see that I didn't stop because part of me didn't want to," Stephanie said. That part liked the secrecy, the insulation from consequence. The honesty surprised them both. Zane nodded slowly. "That part exists in most people. The difference is who feeds it." She looked down. "I did." Repeatedly. Silence stretched. Not hostile. Just waited. "So," Stephanie said at last, voice wavering. What happens now? Zane had spent the past 48 hours rehearsing this conversation. Not word for word, but principle by principle. He'd written notes he didn't bring. He didn't need them anymore. Now, he said, we acknowledge reality instead of negotiating around it. She drew in a shaky breath. Meaning I don't trust you as my partner right now, Zane said evenly. That doesn't make you irredeemable. It makes us unaligned. Her jaw tightened. Trust can be rebuilt. It can, he agreed, but not while the structure is still wobbling. You're saying separation? Yes. The word fell cleanly. No dramatic echo. No finality beyond itself. For how long? Stephanie asked. Is this a break? A trial? No, Zane replied. It's space. Without expectation. Without performance. She swallowed. Are you seeing someone else? No, he said. And I won't while we're still legally married. She looked up sharply. But emotionally, I won't cross that line either, he continued. Not now. Not until everything is resolved honestly. Her shoulders slumped. Relief and regret braided together. And you? She asked carefully. You're free to live your life, Zane said. But I won't be part of it unless it's real. She nodded, tears threatening again. I don't know if I can earn that back. That's something you need to explore, he said gently. Not prove. They discussed logistics next, the necessary unromantic details that emerged once the emotion settled. Zane would move into the spare bedroom temporarily, then find a short-term sublet nearby. They'd split expenses proportionally, revisit arrangements after clarity emerged. No raised voices, no threats, just facts. At one point, Stephanie reached across the table, hesitated, then let her hand fall back. I still love you, she said quietly. Zane didn't dismiss it. He didn't validate it either. I believe you, he said. Love just isn't sufficient without integrity. That night, Zane packed a small bag. Not everything. Just the essentials, clothes, toiletries, the book he was halfway through, the ceramic bowl he'd made in class that leaned slightly left but stood solid. Stephanie watched from the doorway. You're really going, she said. Yes. For how long? For as long as it takes to stop pretending, he replied. She didn't follow him to the door. He didn't expect her to. He stayed the first night at Owen's, temporary, uncomplicated. They ordered food. Watched nothing in particular. You okay? Owen asked. Yes, Zane said, and meant it. The next morning, Zane woke early and walked the neighborhood. He noticed how differently the streets felt when they didn't lead somewhere familiar by default. Later that week, he met Maya for coffee. Not as a date. He clarified that immediately. Good, she said, unoffended. Clarity is underrated. They talked about work, about patterns, about the emotional hangover of disrupted futures. I think most people want to skip the uncertainty part, Maya observed. They chase the next structure before they've dismantled the last one. Zane nodded. I'm done rushing. He met Elena at the studio that weekend. They didn't discuss Stephanie directly. They didn't need to. You grounded? She asked as they cleaned their wheels. Yes, she smiled. That's rarer than people think. When Zane finally signed the short-term lease on a clean, quiet one-bedroom 6 blocks away, he felt something unexpected. Not loss, but alignment completing itself. He returned to the apartment one last time to collect his remaining things. Stephanie helped silently. At the door, she stopped him. I'm starting therapy, she said. Not pleading. Informative. I think that's wise, Zane replied. Does that change anything? He considered her carefully. It gives you new information. What you do with it will determine everything else. She nodded, accepting the answer even if she didn't like it. That night, alone in his new place, Zane sat on the floor eating takeout from its container, the windows open to city noise. His phone buzzed. Text from Elena. New glaze samples arrived. Yours should be fired next week. He smiled. For the first time in years, there was no performance required of him. No correction to manage. No story to uphold. Only reality clearly defined, firmly held. And that, he realized, was where anything worth rebuilding had to begin. Chapter 9, What Remains. The city looked different from Zane's new windows. Not better. Not worse. Just unclaimed. He woke on Sunday to lights slanting across bare floors, the quiet hum of traffic distant and unaccountable. No shared alarms. No negotiations about brunch. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee grounds and fresh paint, both temporary by design. Zane stood in the kitchen, mug warming his palms, and took inventory, not of furniture or boxes, but of himself. He slept through the night. He hadn't checked his phone. He felt steady. The realization came without ceremony, which made it more convincing. Later that morning, he met Elena at the studio. The kiln hummed like a patient animal, heat radiating in waves. Finished pieces lined the shelves, evidence of process, mistakes preserved in glaze. She handed him his bowl. The glaze had settled beautifully. A deep, uneven blue with subtle breaks where the clay showed through. It leaned just slightly. I love it, Zane said. Elena smiled. It didn't try to be perfect. Neither did I, he replied, surprising himself again. They walked to the windows, holding their pieces like fragile truths. Any regrets? She asked, not looking at him. Zane considered. Only the ones that taught me something. She nodded. That's the healthiest answer I've heard all week. They didn't linger. There was no need to manufacture significance. What they shared was mutual regard, not unresolved tension. That afternoon, Zane met Stephanie one final time, not to negotiate terms, but to close a chapter cleanly. They chose a neutral cafe near the river, winter bright and quiet enough for honesty without spectacle. She arrived early. So did he. She looked different, not smaller, more precise. I wanted to thank you, she said after they ordered, for not turning this into something uglier than it had to be. Zane nodded. I wasn't interested in winning. I know, she said. That's part of why losing mattered. She told him about therapy, about learning the difference between validation and connection, about how often she had postponed discomfort until it demanded payment. I don't know what kind of partner I'll be next time, she admitted, but I won't be this version. I hope not, Zane said gently. They didn't reminisce. They didn't eulogize the marriage. They acknowledged it like adults acknowledging a completed structure. Sound for a time no longer necessary. At the door, she hesitated. I'm glad it was you, she said. Even now. Zane met her eyes. Me too. They walked away in opposite directions without looking back. The paperwork took weeks, not because of resistance, but thoroughness. Zane approached it the same way he'd approached everything else lately. Methodical, unpanicked, honest. There were moments of sadness, not for what ended, but for the version of himself that had once mistaken endurance for virtue. He donated furniture, reframed photos, built a life that required presence to maintain. Work stabilized. He received a quiet promotion he hadn't chased. Maya congratulated him over coffee, genuinely pleased. You seem settled, she observed. I found my footing, Zane said. Turns out it wasn't where I left it. He continued pottery, continued walking, continued choosing what aligned rather than what reassured others. Months later, on an evening that smelled like rain and hot asphalt, Zane invited Elena to dinner. Not casually, not defensively, deliberately. I'd like to take you out, he said, meeting her gaze without contingency. Not to fill space, to explore it. She smiled slow, considered. I was hoping you'd say that when you were ready. I am, he said. They took their time. They talked about boundaries as openly as weather. They moved without pretense. It wasn't explosive. It was grounded. One night, weeks later, as they sat on his couch, her legs tucked under her, his shoulders supporting her weight, Elena traced the faint indentation on his finger where a ring had once lived. Does it still hurt? She asked. Zane thought honestly. No, it taught me. She nodded, satisfied with the answer. Outside, the city went on. Imperfect, alive, unconcerned. Zane didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt present. And presence, he knew now, was the only confidence worth keeping, and the only foundation on which anything real could stand. Chapter 10 Forward intentionally. A year passed in increments too small to notice while they were happening. Zane marked time differently now, not by anniversaries or shared calendars, but by accumulation. Mornings that began without negotiation. Workdays that ended without bracing. Evenings chosen rather than defaulted. On a cool October morning, he stood in the kitchen of his apartment. No longer new, no longer temporary. Watching Elena pace the narrow space with a mug in her hands, already narrating a problem she hadn't yet asked him to solve. The glaze order is delayed, she said. Again. Which means the workshop might miss its opening window, unless I switch suppliers, which I don't want to do because quality matters, Zane finished, smiling. She stopped. You do listen. Yes, he said, but selectively. I've learned restraint. She laughed and leaned into him, the motion unforced, familiar. They fit easily together, in speech, in silence, in space. No choreography required. Their relationship had not been dramatic. It had not needed to be. They had moved forward deliberately. Conversations before assumptions, time before declarations. When they disagreed, they did it plainly, without theatrical escalation. They had both lived long enough inside misalignment to recognize the value of steadiness when it appeared. On a Friday evening in late autumn, Zane attended a gallery opening Elena had helped curate, small, earnest, populated with people who spoke passionately about clay as if it were a philosophy rather than a medium. As he watched her explain a piece to a visitor, hands confident, voice precise, he felt something warm settle into place. Not possession, not certainty. Contentment. Later, as they walked home, Elena slipped her arm through his. I've been thinking, she said. Zane braced reflexively, then relaxed. About what? About how often people confuse intensity with meaning, she said. As if it only counts if it almost breaks you. Zane nodded. I used to believe that. And now I think meaning is quieter, he said. But more durable. She smiled. Good answer. At home, they cooked together in efficient harmony, shoulders brushing, music playing low. The bowl Zane had made sat on the counter, now holding a collection of keys that belonged to exactly one life. Later, as the city settled into itself outside the windows, Elena rested her head against his shoulder. "You're very present," she said. "It's rare." Zane considered her words with the seriousness they deserved. "I learned the cost of absence," he replied. "Once you pay it, you don't forget." There were no flashbacks, no lingering bitterness. Stephanie existed now only as a completed chapter, a person he wished well without requiring proximity to prove it. He'd heard, through Lila, that she was doing better, healthier, more honest with herself than she'd ever been. He hoped so. Some nights, Zane walked alone through the neighborhood, noticing the city the way one noticed breath, always moving, never asking permission. Other nights, Elena joined him, their steps falling naturally into sync. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. Not because it was predictable, but because he trusted his own alignment within it. He had learned where his lines were, how to draw them early, how to maintain them without aggression, how to honor them without apology. On a spring morning not much different from the one where this all began, Zane stood at the window as sunlight climbed the buildings across the street. Elena still slept behind him, one hand curled at her side. He felt no need to wake her. He made coffee quietly, stood there, mug warming his palms, city rising around him. Life, he knew now, didn't reward endurance. It rewarded clarity. And for the first time, Zane Mitchell wasn't reacting to what had happened. He was choosing what came next, forward, intentionally.